Tina and Francis had been married for about 3 years. Their marriage could have probably been called a happy one if it weren't for the fact that they didn't have children. Meanwhile, it was the husband who worried about it the most. "I need a son, an heir, do you get it?" Francis said forcefully. Tina only shrugged her shoulders guiltily in response, saying that it was out of her control. Unfortunately, it was extremely hard to convince her obstinate husband of anything. Francis was sure that their inability to have children was his wife's fault, and more than anything in the world, wanted her to deal with her problems. But when Tina finally got pregnant, there was nothing to deal with anymore. "Finally, I will soon have an heir," Francis exclaimed joyfully. "Darling, do you even realize that we could be having a girl?" Tina asked, smiling. Her words made Francis immediately change in face, getting gloomy and thoughtful. The man's expression made it obvious that the prospect of having a daughter didn't fit into his plans. Tina waited for the ultrasound with an uneasy heart. When the time for it finally came, her joy knew no bounds. "Congratulations, ma'am. You're definitely having a girl," announced the doctor who performed the ultrasound. This news made Tina feel uncertain. On the one hand, she was incredibly happy to be having a daughter, and on the other hand, she was upset that Francis was unlikely to share her joy. Her husband was a domineering and cruel man, accustomed to having everyone obey him. He was the captain of the varsity football team in the past and was used to being in the spotlight. And now he treated Tina more like a servant than a wife. "There you go. I knew you'd give me a daughter instead of a son. Well, there's nothing we can do about it. We'll have to raise her," Francis said with disappointment in his voice. Biting her lip, Tina decided to ignore his comment and got to doing housework. Least of all, the pregnant woman wanted to fight with her husband, who was in such an irritated state. Of course, Tina knew that Francis would never hit her, but she didn't want to tempt fate nonetheless. Instead, she cooked her husband's favorite roast and pretended that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "My mother was right when she advised me against marrying Francis," the woman thought, looking at the wedding photo hanging on the wall. The fact was that Tina's mother, Barbara Cooper, was great at reading people thanks to her extensive life experience. She knew right away that her daughter's fiancé would turn into a family tyrant. Unfortunately, Tina didn't take her mother's words seriously and didn't follow her advice. She later regretted it on numerous occasions, but she never dared to leave Francis. After learning that she was carrying Francis's baby, Tina didn't want to do it either. Throughout her entire pregnancy, the woman felt unwell, suffering from morning sickness and dizziness. To help Tina carrying her pregnancy to term, the doctors decided to admit her into the hospital 2 weeks before her due date. The days were boring and eventless and seemed to drag on painfully slow. The expectant mother had to share her room with other women who needed to stay under the doctor's supervision just like her. Tina's contractions started around midnight. Her little daughter decided to be born a week before her due date. To Tina's great relief, the labor was quick and almost painless. "God, and I was so afraid of this day. That wasn't scary at all," the young mother thought. And when Tina heard the cry of her newborn daughter for the first time, her joy knew no bounds. During the entire time she spent at the hospital, Francis came to see her only twice. Each time he attributed his absence to his extensive workload and fatigue. But even when he did visit his wife, his reluctance was all too obvious. Maybe Francis was still upset about having a daughter instead of a son. Or maybe he considered visiting his wife at the hospital to be a sign of weakness? When choosing her daughter's name, Tina didn't hesitate long. She named the baby Diana after her late grandmother. To Tina's surprise, her mother had a rather restrained reaction to her choice. However, Barbara Cooper flatly refused to disclose the reasons for her frustration. The week flew by so quickly that it was definitely time for Tina and the baby to go home. Tina was in high spirits all day. And then something very strange happened, which overshadowed the joy of the young mother. The fact was that one of the new mothers decided to abandon her newborn daughter and fled from the hospital through an open window at night. How's that even possible? Leaving your own daughter? What's going to happen to the baby now? Tina asked, having a hard time getting a hold of herself. Well, the baby will stay at the hospital until all the paperwork is ready, and then she'll be transferred to an orphanage. They say that the baby's mother was from a very poor family, so she simply ran away, the on-call nurse explained. At this moment, Tina felt devastated for the abandoned baby, thinking of the fate that awaited her. She didn't do anything wrong. Why does she have to pay for her mother's mistakes? I need to talk to Frances. She should adopt this baby, Tina thought, barely holding back her tears. But when the young mother called Frances and told her husband about the abandoned baby, his disappointment knew no bounds. Not only did you have a daughter instead of a son, but also want to adopt an abandoned baby? But honey, she's so little. She can grow up with our Diana. Tina tried to object, but her husband didn't want to hear any of it. If you bring her home, I'll file for divorce right that second, Frances said instead of goodbye and hung up. Having heard her husband out, Tina got to thinking. She used to indulge her husband's every whim and always agreed with his decisions. But now, when Tina became a mother of a wonderful baby, she felt an unprecedented inner strength that could work real miracles. No, Frances, not this time. This time I'll do this my way, Tina thought. The young woman immediately informed her mother of her intention. Barbara Cooper turned out to be a smart woman and chose not to make a scene. Upon learning that her daughter wanted to adopt the abandoned baby, she promised to help her. Moreover, Mrs. Cooper couldn't help but tear up. She felt very proud of her daughter's decision. Don't worry about anything, dear. I'll make sure that you get custody of that baby, and then you'll have 2 beautiful daughters, Barbara said. Tina's joy knew no bounds, and even the thought that her marriage might end didn't even frighten the woman. Thanks to the connections of Mrs. Cooper, her daughter and the 2 babies, Diana and Nancy, got to go home the very next day. Realizing that Tina needed help, her mother temporarily moved in with her. The babies looked so similar that they could easily be mistaken for biological sisters. According to the paperwork, Tina gave birth to twins, and she was incredibly happy about that fact. The young mother realized that it was the best way for her to help the abandoned baby, whose own mother couldn't take care of her for some unknown reason. Of course, Tina's decision caused Frances to throw a fit. Now there's definitely no going back. Get ready for a divorce. But now that Tina felt the happiness of motherhood, her husband's words no longer had that big of an effect on her. She spent her days taking care of the babies, changing their diapers and feeding them with formula. However, Tina was still haunted by just one question. Why was her mother so supportive of her decision to adopt the baby? For the longest time, Tina couldn't figure out a way to ask her mother about it. Having plucked up her courage, the woman finally asked her mother about it, since it was very important to her. To Tina's great surprise, Barbara Cooper blushed to the very roots of her hair, and then lowered her eyes in embarrassment. It was the first time that Tina saw her mother feel so uncomfortable, so she didn't even know what to do. Mrs. Cooper was the first to break the long and awkward pause. Honey, there's a lot you don't know. The fact is that many years ago, I abandoned my newborn daughter, just like the mother of this little girl. To say that Tina was shocked by her mother's words would be the understatement of the century. Meanwhile, Barbara Cooper continued her story. It was my mother who pressured me into doing it. The baby's father broke up with me, and I was depressed. And then my mother. Basically, I left my daughter at the hospital. So you have a sister somewhere out there in the world. Thus, having learned that someone abandoned their child, I immediately supported your decision to help that baby, Mrs. Cooper whispered with tears in her eyes. Only now did Tina understand her mother's motives. Unable to contain her emotions, she hugged the woman who was her closest person in the entire world. Of course Tina forgave her mother, because she understood that she had already punished herself enough for what she did. The pain and shame Barbara Cooper felt all this time were much worse than anyone else's condemnation. Helping her daughter adopt the abandoned baby, Barbara was trying to correct the mistake she had made many years ago. After that memorable conversation, Barbara Cooper stayed in her daughter's house for good. Together they raised the little girls and cared for them with touching motherly tenderness. About a month after Tina was discharged from the hospital, Frances came to see her and wanted to make up. But Tina already knew what she wanted from her life, so she refused to take him back. If it was only about her, she might have been able to forgive Frances, but not now. He'd crossed too many lines, betraying the most sacred thing in life, their newborn daughter. Tina couldn't forgive him for it, and having decided to start a new life, she was 100% sure that she had made the right decision.